Today's video has been sponsored by Blade Idol. Do you know what both CPU 1 leader Yoshinori Kitase and CPU 3 leader Naoki Yoshida have in common? Yes, they're both the leaders of the two mainline Final Fantasy divisions working on Final Fantasy VII Rebirth and Final Fantasy XVI respectively. But they've also confirmed at one point or another that turn-based combat won't be returning anytime soon. Both of them giving some glimmer of hope that who knows what the next director will decide to do, though it seems incredibly doubtful that it will happen. But the question remains, why is it that turn-based combat is avoided in Final Fantasy? What do they hope to achieve with action game design, and have they achieved it? Today, we'll be answering all these questions and more. But first, a word from our sponsor, Blade Idol. Blade Idol is a true idol RPG. It uses high-quality live 2D graphics, and you won't be able to take your eyes off of it, with unique 2D characters and colorful skills. Adventure through the main stages with challenging normal and special dungeons to collect growth materials. Have a ton of flexibility with your character with combinations of various growth factors, like ability enhancement, skill improvement, and weapons and costumes. If you're too busy to log into the game, feel free to idle anytime, anywhere, with an equal growth environment between online and offline. Currently, there's the event Hot Summer Present that'll give you 10,000 diamonds, 50,000 enchant stones, and 20,000 option enhanced stones, so you won't want to wait. Be sure to check out Blade Idol with the link in the description below. Growing up during the golden era of JRPGs, the genre was practically synonymous with turn-based combat. And as a kid, I couldn't help but think playing such games as Pokemon Red and Blue, wouldn't it be better if I could actually run around as the monster? Indeed, uncultured swine I was, not realizing how sophisticated and deep turn-based combat truly is. And as I grew older into my teen years, I would develop a deep appreciation for these combat systems. As time has gone on, however, turn-based games are no longer the predominant genre we associate JRPGs with, even remakes of traditionally turn-based games and ATB games now becoming action games. It all begs the question, is turn-based dying as a genre, or at least its role within Final Fantasy? I will now take this time to explicitly state nowhere in this video am I stating that action is superior to turn-based in any regard, nor am I even necessarily saying I agree or disagree with this decision that Square's made. This is literally just my analysis of why they have decided to do so. And with that, let me start by saying I love turn-based combat. I remember the first turn-based combat system that I truly fell in love with was Final Fantasy X's conditional turn-based battle system. Being able to see the turn order, the rock, paper, scissors nature of enemy weaknesses, and being able to swap party members at any moment made me feel like I was Lelouch v Britannia, as I strategized around the game's more difficult boss fights. And at its core, this is what makes turn-based combat so addictive. But a great turn-based system is about more than your decisions inside of battle. More often than not, it's about your decisions outside of battle. The actual fun of Final Fantasy VII's combat isn't the commands you select during combat, but in fact plugging shiny balls into your weapons in the main menu. Just like me doing this plug and telling you to smack that subscribe button for this channel's 5-year anniversary. We're trying to hit 90k subs. It was this addictive loop that JRPGs as a genre would become known for. So much so that it's still not too uncommon to hear JRPG boomers say something like, "It's not a JRPG unless it's turn-based." And here I thought the J in JRPG meant Japanese and not turn-based. As time would go on, however, series such as Final Fantasy would move away from turn-based. Even Persona 5, at one point in the game's development, they considered making it an action game. There's speculation that Dragon Quest XII might be an action game after Yuji Horii made comments about changes to the current command-driven style. It may seem grim, but it's not all fire and brimstone. I think it's incredibly important to acknowledge that even in the modern day, turn-based is still adored. Games such as Fire Emblem Three Houses and Persona 5 are proof that turn-based games can absolutely thrive in the modern day and age. age, while still receiving incredible reception and more than decent sales in the millions. There are even anomalies like Yakuza 7, so in observing this, you have to wonder why Final Fantasy is so adamant about switching combat styles. To do this, we have to acknowledge the drastic shift in the Japanese game industry. Japan once had an incredibly thriving console market, and it was a force to be reckoned with. As many of you already know, this is no longer the case. With little less than 10 million of PS4's total 117 million are currently sold in Japan. Home consoles don't seem to have the appeal they once did in this market, coming off of PlayStation 1 selling 21 million units and PlayStation 2 selling over 25 million units in the region. This is pretty alarming. This sharp decline in console gaming in Japan has led a lot of Japanese developers to give more attention to Western markets. Ever notice how many of these games not only have global releases now, but in cases like Final Fantasy XVI are even prioritizing English voice acting, to the point of where in FF16, arguably the Japanese version is the dub? The answer is, quite simply, because there's more money for them to be made in these markets than there currently is at home. And to contextualize how big Western console markets are, if you think Final Fantasy is a high-selling RPG franchise, it pales in comparison to titles like The Witcher 3, which has sold 30 million copies. And if you're thinking, what do combat systems have to do with regional console sales? How often do you see a AAA Western RPG with turn-based combat? You don't, and there's a reason for that. But it's not just appealing to Western markets either. Action RPGs such as Monster Hunter and the Soulsborne games have become absolute phenomenons in Japan. So the question then becomes, why not create something that the Japanese market clearly enjoys, and something that is also hugely profitable in the West, as it's just the best way to hit the center of the Venn diagram. And while turn-based games can sell incredibly well, there are very few 10 million plus seller turn-based games, but there's quite a few number of 10 million plus seller action RPGs. The exception of course being Pokemon. Now, Pokemon is commonly used as a counterexample in these discussions, and I don't think it's a good counterexample. Yes, it is a highly successful turn-based JRPG, but I don't think it's unreasonable to say that Pokemon isn't successful specifically because it's turn-based. It isn't as though 10-year-old kids are going up to mom and saying, please get me this game so I can engage in strategic turn-based battles. In fact, Pokemon games are so easy they could hardly be called strategic in general. But also, at least in my case, I asked my mom for the game because I thought Charizard was cool. And that's the exact point. The games are sought after because they sell the fantasy of becoming a Pokemon trainer, and the combat is a serviceable enough abstraction to allow them to enjoy that fantasy. Ask yourself why no other turn-based JRPG even comes remotely close to Pokemon's success. The conclusion is that it is not the average case scenario. It is, for whatever reason you may attribute it to be, an exception. There isn't any firm way to measure to what degree an action RPG will sell more than a turn-based one, though it seems Square Enix's market research is quite firm that it will. Anecdotally, Final Fantasy XV might already be the biggest indicator of how successful the Switch was. Being the first game to fully switch to action combat, the game saw explosive sales, selling the entirety of Final Fantasy XIII's console lifetime sales of 6 million in roughly a month's time. Even despite Final Fantasy XV's mixed reception, it would then go on to sell 10 million units and become the third highest selling non-MMO entry in the Final Fantasy series, behind Final Fantasy VII and Final Fantasy X, bringing in several first-timers to the series. And if you ask them why they decided to hop in at FF15, a lot of the answers will be in the ballpark of the switch away from turn-based menu-driven combat to action combat, with many first-timers I've spoken to saying the same for Final Fantasy VII Remake. Then there's what Naoki Yoshida has recently mentioned, the age demographic, with him saying, quote, "I'm from a generation that grew up with command and turn-based RPGs. I think I understand how interesting and impressive it can be. On the other hand, for the past decade or so, I've seen quite a number of opinions saying, I don't understand the attraction of selecting commands in video games. This opinion is only increasing, particularly with younger audiences who do not typically play RPGs. This is not an argument of what is good or bad, but there is a difference based on players' preferences and age. As I said, I know the fun of command RPGs, and I want to continue developing them, but I thought about the expected sales of Final Fantasy XVI and the impact we have to deliver. There's almost no denying that in terms of the age demographic, he's absolutely correct. Final Fantasy as it stands doesn't do particularly well with a younger audience as it used to. Currently, my channel sits at around 25 million channel views, and is one of the more watched FF-focused channels on YouTube, but my 18 to 24-year-old demographic is pretty abysmal. You may say that maybe it's just my brand, but talking to other FF content creators, it seems doubtful that it is. Let's not get started on that 13 to 17-year-old demographic, which is basically non-existent. You guys cut the blood trail in FF7R to keep it 18 rated game to appeal to these guys, and it looks like they didn't even show up. From what we can glean, however, Final Fantasy XVI is aimed at trying to capture the young adult audience of 18 to 24. So it's worth noting that when Yoshi P is talking about a younger audience here, that's clearly the audience that he's talking about. And whether action combat will be able to do that specifically, I think it ultimately can. And while the 18 to 24-year-old demographic doesn't seem to be interested in watching Final Fantasy videos, they definitely are interested in watching my Nier Automata videos. Make whatever you will of that. Ultimately, these are the reasons I believe Square Enix has chosen to focus on action combat. It really all comes down to money and how much they think the games can sell and meeting those sales targets. The Switch has shown incredibly strong success with FF15 being one of the best-selling games in the series, and it's something that has strong appeal both in the Japanese and Western markets, as well with a younger demographic that Final Fantasy is struggling with and has been struggling with. And if none of that works, then well, FF will stay one for the boomers. But let me know your thoughts on this in the comments below, and be sure to check out Blade Idol with the link in the description below.